A racist and corrupt police officer was blocking a black woman from entering the federal courthouse. He looked her up and down like she was out of place, like her very existence there was some kind of mistake. She stood tall, calm, with her credentials in hand, but he wouldn't even glance at them. He waved her off with a smug smile, leaned closer with that condescending tone so many know too well, and said, "You don't look like someone who belongs here. Maybe try the public seating area, or the delivery entrance. Unless you're here to clean something." His words hit with the force of a slap, but she didn't flinch. She just looked at him. Not with fear. With disappointment. Because it wasn't the first time. And she knew exactly what this moment meant. Behind her, people began to stare. Some smirked. Others looked away, uncomfortable. But no one said a word. That silence, that complicity, that everyday routine humiliation, it echoed louder than anything. He reached for his radio, already calling for backup, ready to make a scene out of nothing but a power trip and prejudice. She took a breath. One deep breath. And calmly pulled out her phone. No yelling. No begging. Just one call. 30 seconds. That's all it took. He laughed as she dialed. "Who are you gonna call, sweetheart? Your boyfriend? Your pastor?" He was enjoying this. The public humiliation. The control. But while he was still laughing, something changed in the air. The courthouse security suddenly got quiet. Whispers. Movement. Doors that had been locked swung open. Dark SUVs pulled up outside. Men and women in black suits exited quickly and approached the building. And yet, she didn't move. She was still standing right there, silent, composed, holding her phone at her side. Then came the voice in his earpiece, "Stand down. Now." He blinked. "What?" The voice repeated, "Stand down. Immediately. She has full federal clearance." He looked at her again, but this time his smile cracked. Confusion twisted into unease. His hand dropped from his radio. "Wait, who are you?" She stepped forward slowly, looked him straight in the eyes, and said in a low, steady voice that carried across the marble lobby, "You just tried to block the Director of National Security from a federal hearing. And now you're going to answer for it." That moment, it wasn't just a reversal. It was justice wrapping its fingers around the very throat of arrogance. The same arrogance that had denied her entry, denied her dignity, denied her legitimacy. In front of dozens of witnesses, the tables flipped with devastating precision. He was frozen. Pale. Speechless. As the agents swarmed past him, saluting her, escorting her in. Cameras turned. Reporters whispered. And just like that, everything he thought he controlled was gone. But what no one in that room knew, what no one could have guessed, was that this day wasn't just about a blocked entrance or a badge. It wasn't even about him. It was about something deeper. A history between them that went far beyond this courthouse. A buried past. A debt owed. And a secret that, once revealed, would leave the entire country watching in stunned silence. Because this wasn't the first time he'd tried to bring her down. Years ago, he stood in her way once before. Back when she wasn't powerful. When she wasn't protected. When she had everything to lose and no one to back her up. He humiliated her then too. And he thought she'd never recover. But she didn't just recover, she rose higher than he ever imagined. Now she was back. Not for revenge. For justice. The courtroom she was entering held more than a federal hearing. It held the truth about corruption at the highest levels, including his own. She had evidence. She had allies. And today, she wasn't just walking in as a witness, she was walking in as the reckoning he never saw coming. The question now isn't whether she'll bring him down. It's how deep the rot goes, and how many others will fall with him. So what exactly happened in that courtroom? And what did he do to her all those years ago that made this moment so much more than just justice? You'll want to hear this story. Every word of it. Because by the end, you'll understand why she didn't just walk into that courtroom. She owned it. Before we begin this story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every black viewer watching this video. We see you, we hear you, and we stand with you. Here on Plow of Twist, we believe in justice, dignity, and the right to walk through every door with your head held high, without fear, without shame. We do not tolerate racism in any form. Ever. You matter. Your story matters. And your voice deserves to be heard. Now, get ready for a powerful and emotional story that will stay with you. Don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist and hit that like button, because stories like this one, they need to be told. Enjoy the journey. Houston, Texas was already sweating under the weight of a June morning when Imani Bennett stepped out of her car, shoulders squared, back straight, the soft clack of her heels echoing off the steps of the federal courthouse. She didn't pause. She didn't glance at the officers on duty. She didn't need to. For most people walking up those stairs, there was always some degree of nervousness, papers shuffled, coats adjusted, IDs clutched tight like shields. But Imani walked like she'd built those stairs herself. Like each step was hers by right. Because it was. Yet in a world where the color of your skin could make people forget your title before they even asked for your name, confidence wasn't just a trait, it was armor. Imani had risen through a system that wasn't built for her. A system that took one look at her brown skin, her natural curls, her calm gaze, and immediately underestimated her. She knew it. She felt it in the way people looked twice when she entered a room, in the way security double-checked her clearance when she traveled, in the way some senators still struggled to say, "Madam Director," without hesitation. She didn't waste energy trying to change that. She used it. Every assumption, every doubt thrown her way, it became fuel. At 39, she wasn't just part of the U.S. security structure. She was the top of it. The Director of National Security. A title earned not with favors or family names, but with grit, intelligence, and the kind of composure that could disarm a room without ever raising her voice. Born and raised on the south side of Chicago, Imani knew struggle intimately. Her mother, Rochelle Bennett, had worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on, nurse by day, waitress by night. Her father left before she could speak her first word. But strength ran in Rochelle's blood, and she passed it down in nightly lessons over leftover dinner. "You don't let this world tell you who you are," Rochelle would say. "You tell it." Imani did just that. Top of her class at Howard. Recruited straight into counterterrorism. Fluent in Arabic and French. Brilliant in logistics. Unshakable under pressure. While others played politics, she mastered silence. Strategy. She knew how to listen more than she spoke, and when she did speak, people listened. But the road wasn't smooth. Not even close. Her rise through the ranks had been littered with obstacles, some visible, others not. Disrespect masked as casual remarks. Competency tests others never had to take. Supervisors who saw her potential as threatening rather than promising. And there had been moments she wanted to quit. Days she'd driven home from Capitol Hill so drained she couldn't even unbuckle her seatbelt for 10 minutes. But she never let it break her. Because she had a vision, not just for herself, but for what leadership could look like when power wasn't inherited, but earned. The courthouse today wasn't just another assignment. It was high profile. Sensitive. A closed-door briefing on a leaked intelligence document tied to a domestic threat, a case Imani had been personally overseeing for months. Her presence wasn't optional. She was the lead federal authority on the matter. But none of that mattered to Officer Cole Harlon. Harlon was the kind of man who'd been wearing the same uniform for over 20 years, yet never changed the way he saw the world. To him, security was about control, not service. He wasn't interested in evolving, in understanding the communities he policed, in questioning his own biases. His idea of justice was rigid, self-serving, and deeply laced with prejudice. And while he'd managed to avoid formal complaints, anyone who'd worked under him, or crossed his path, knew the look in his eye when he saw someone who didn't fit the part. Black, brown, too confident, too assertive, he'd find a reason to challenge them. Block them. Humiliate them. It wasn't always loud. But it was always intentional. That morning, as Imani approached the courthouse entrance, Harlon was stationed at the main checkpoint. He saw her. Dismissed her before she even reached the steps. Didn't ask for ID. Didn't check the clearance list on his clipboard. Just stood in front of the door, hands on his belt, and said it like a joke. "Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to step back. This area's for authorized personnel only." She handed him her badge without a word. A badge that bore the golden seal of the Department of National Security. A badge that should have made him stand at attention. He looked at it, smirked, and handed it back without even reading the name. "Nice try." Imani didn't flinch. She never did. But inside her chest, something old stirred. That familiar tightening. That flicker of rage she'd learned to compress into silence. She tried again, more direct this time. "I'm here on federal authority. I need access to the hearing on 4B. Harlon crossed his arms. "Yeah, and I'm the President of the United States. Credentials or not, I'm not letting anyone through who doesn't pass my eye test." It was said with a grin. The kind that said he knew exactly what he was doing. The kind that said he was enjoying it. Behind her, people began to gather. Other officers. Courthouse staff. Lawyers. No one intervened. No one spoke. Some watched with curiosity. Others with discomfort. A few with satisfaction. This wasn't just about a door anymore. It was about hierarchy. Territory. Ego. But most of all, it was about perception. To Harlon, she was just another black woman trying to push her way through. No suit, no badge, no authority could override that in his eyes. And still, Imani didn't raise her voice. She didn't curse. Didn't shout. She stepped back, pulled out her phone, and made a call. One she'd hoped she'd never have to make. Because she believed in protocol. In discretion. But she also believed in accountability. And sometimes, justice starts with letting the right people know that a line has been crossed. As she waited, she could feel the heat of shame, not on herself, but on the system that allowed this to keep happening. That let men like Harlon wear badges while stripping others of dignity. The irony of it all, the fact that she had spent her entire career protecting a country that, at any given moment, could decide she didn't belong, wasn't lost on her. But she also knew that the tables were about to turn. And this time, the consequences wouldn't be swept under the rug. Imani wasn't just a symbol of what was possible. She was the living, breathing proof that excellence didn't need validation from men like Harlon. But that didn't mean he wouldn't be held responsible for the humiliation he'd inflicted, on her and on every other woman who'd ever been made to feel small when they were anything but. Inside the courthouse, the air was tense. The hearing couldn't start without her. Whispers of delay. People growing impatient. Phones vibrating with alerts. And outside, that moment, the one unfolding between Harlon and Imani, was about to ripple far beyond those steps. What had begun as another morning in Houston would soon become a national headline. And at the center of it would be a black woman who refused to shrink and a man whose actions would finally catch up to him. But before any of that could happen, before the cameras arrived and the statements were issued and the press descended, there was only silence. Two figures standing face to face. One, armed with arrogance and ignorance. The other, with patience and power. And somewhere, beneath the surface, a secret waited. A connection neither of them had acknowledged yet. A history buried under layers of time and consequence. Because this wasn't the first time they'd met. Not even close. The glass doors of the courthouse didn't open quickly enough to swallow the moment that had just unfolded outside. As Imani walked past Officer Harlon, surrounded now by a small cluster of federal agents who had emerged seemingly out of nowhere, there was no satisfaction in her expression. No smugness. Just purpose. Each step down that echoing hallway toward courtroom 4B was a reminder that she didn't come here to make a scene. She came here to do her job. But now, the job had layers. Now, she had to carry more than intelligence reports and national threat assessments, she had to carry the weight of one man's arrogance and the quiet complicity of every person who watched and said nothing. Inside, the air was cool and tight with tension. She nodded silently to the clerk at the end of the corridor, then to the security panel where she scanned her badge. The door buzzed open, and for a moment, she let herself pause, not because she doubted, but because moments like these always reminded her how far she'd come. Then she stepped inside. The courtroom was full, attorneys on one side, federal prosecutors on the other, a select group of senators seated in the rear, shielded by confidentiality clauses and non-disclosure agreements. Imani's presence made the quiet murmur subside. She could feel the weight of eyes shifting to her, gauging her demeanor, her authority. Her seat was waiting. Front and center. Reserved for the lead on national security briefings. As she took her place, a young analyst leaned toward her with a whisper. "They've delayed proceedings for over 20 minutes. They wouldn't start without you." She nodded once, but her attention wasn't fully on the hearing. Not yet. She was still hearing Harlon's voice in her mind. Still seeing his smirk. Still feeling that cold stab in her gut, that bitter reminder that no amount of rank or decorum could shield her from the daily cuts of racism that never quite healed. But what he didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that this wasn't the first time he'd stood in her way. The hearing began with dry formalities. Introductions. Case identifiers. The matter at hand was serious. A series of encrypted messages traced to a fringe domestic group known to have infiltrated several government platforms. Their rhetoric was dangerous. Their plans, still vague, were alarming enough to trigger national security protocols. Imani had been tracking them for months. And now, it was time to present her findings. She stood, adjusted the mic, and began to speak, not with volume, but with precision. She walked the room through the digital breadcrumbs that led from seemingly benign message boards to encrypted apps and finally to concrete threats made against federal buildings. She laid out timelines, locations, recruitment patterns. Names. Connections. One of those names, she revealed, had a familiar ring within certain circles. A name tied to a Houston-based ex-military contractor. Someone who had once trained courthouse security. Someone who still had ties inside the system. She didn't say it out loud, not yet. But her eyes scanned the room slowly as if daring someone to interrupt. One of the senators leaned forward. "Are you suggesting internal collusion?" Imani answered without flinching. "I'm suggesting that certain security protocols have been compromised. Possibly even weaponized. We believe there may be current employees with active affiliations to this group." A low wave of murmuring rippled through the room. The weight of her words changed the air. The prosecutor glanced sideways, unease etched across his face. The idea that someone behind a badge could be involved in these threats wasn't just disturbing, it was dangerous. But Imani wasn't done. She had more. She had data. Patterns. Logs. Connections that pointed to something even darker than extremism, infiltration. Back in the hallway, Harlon was still at his post, trying to piece together what had just happened. Another officer, a younger one named Ruiz, approached him cautiously. "You good, man?" Harlon looked at him, jaw tight. "They pulled rank." "Doesn't mean anything." Ruiz shifted. "That wasn't just some federal suit, Cole. I heard someone say she runs national security. Like, the top. Harlon scoffed. Yeah. Then why didn't she look like it? Ruiz said nothing. But his silence said everything. A few minutes later, Harlon's radio crackled to life. His name was called. He was requested inside courtroom 4B. That wasn't standard. Courthouse security didn't usually step into federal briefings. But the voice on the line wasn't asking, it was ordering. He walked the same hallway Imani had walked earlier, but slower. His steps weren't certain. They were calculating. Defensive. When the door opened, he entered to silence. The kind of silence that follows bad news. The judge looked at him. Then at Imani. She stood. Officer Cole Harlon, please approach the bench. He hesitated. She didn't blink. Now. He walked toward her, confused, trying to mask it with indifference. What is this about? He muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. She replied in the same tone. It's about accountability. The judge spoke, formal and cool. Officer Harlon, a question has been raised regarding potential links between courthouse security personnel and extremist threats currently under federal investigation. You've been named in internal surveillance logs, and as of this morning, your conduct has prompted an immediate review. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Imani turned, addressed the court. The man standing here blocked a federal officer from entering this courtroom less than an hour ago. He ignored her credentials. Denied her clearance. Made racially loaded comments in a public space. That alone warrants disciplinary action. But what's more concerning is this: his name appears in a flag training document tied to a paramilitary contractor with extremist affiliations. That's not coincidence. That's a lead. The silence exploded. Everyone reacted differently, some in disbelief, others with knowing unease. The prosecutor leaned in urgently, whispering to the judge. A security agent moved toward Harlon, slow and measured. For the first time, the arrogance in his eyes cracked. I don't know what this is, Harlon stammered, louder now. This is some kind of mistake, Imani cut him off, her voice steady. The mistake was thinking no one was watching. He turned to her, voice rising. You're doing this because of this morning. This is personal. She stared at him. Cold. Clear. It stopped being personal when you became a threat. The room shifted. The judge called a recess. People stood, buzzing, whispering, heads turning toward Harlon as he stood frozen, stuck between denial and fear. Agents led him away for questioning. He didn't resist. Not because he accepted it, but because the weight of it was too sudden. Too fast. Back in her seat, Imani breathed. Not relief. Not yet. The hardest part was still ahead. The deeper connections. The other names. The bigger story hidden beneath all the paperwork and technicalities. What had happened that morning was just the surface. Beneath it was something else. Something that had started long before either of them knew how far it would go. Because what no one in that courtroom knew, not the judge, not the senators, not even the agents who now escorted Harlon to a private interview room, was that Imani had seen this man before. Not just today. Not just this week. Years ago. Different city. Different badge. A memory she had buried because it hurt too much to carry. But that memory was about to come back. And when it did, it would change everything they thought they knew about both of them. The truth wasn't just about today's humiliation. It was about a moment in the past that had shaped the woman Imani had become. And now, for the first time in over a decade, that moment was about to be revealed. The conference room inside the federal courthouse was colder than the rest of the building, both in temperature and in atmosphere. It was a sealed-off wing used for classified discussions, thick glass, gray walls, no windows. The agents stationed outside kept the press away, while inside, a small group of officials, analysts, and legal advisors sat around a long table, the tension in the room coiling tighter with every passing minute. Imani stood near the center, silent, arms crossed, eyes on the digital file projected on the far wall. Her voice had been the last one heard before the room fell into this heavy silence. No one interrupted. They were still processing what she'd just revealed. Harlon, now seated across from her with his wrists free but posture stiff, was trying to maintain the same smug indifference that had carried him through years of unchecked authority. But it wasn't holding anymore. The corners of his mouth twitched with uncertainty, and a sheen of sweat darkened the collar of his uniform. The official heading the internal investigation, Special Counsel Everett, finally broke the silence. "We need to go over the past records tied to this contractor," he said without looking at anyone in particular. "If what Director Bennett is suggesting is accurate, we have a serious breach not just of security, but of intent." His voice was clipped, formal, but beneath it was fear that what Imani had uncovered wasn't a fluke, but a pattern. She didn't respond. She kept her eyes on Harlon, who now shifted in his seat. He tried to speak casually. "This is a witch hunt. You're reading too much into nothing. My name was on some old files because I worked a side job years ago. Everybody in this building's done some private work. That doesn't make me a traitor." Imani stepped forward slowly. "It's not the file that concerns me," she said, her tone calm but sharper than any accusation. "It's the context. The patterns. The meetings you never logged. The transactions that don't match your reported income. The encrypted forums accessed from your courthouse terminal. And the names you dropped in rooms you were never supposed to be in." He laughed, short and dry. "You think you're untouchable now, don't you? Just because they gave you a title, a badge, some clearance, you think that makes you better?" She looked at him for a long time before speaking. "No. I don't think I'm better. I think I'm exactly what this country said I could never be. And that terrifies you." Harlan's smirk dropped. He leaned forward. "This is revenge. That's all this is. You're using your position to settle a score." Imani's expression didn't change. "You think too small," she said. "This isn't about a score. This is about accountability. Something you've never had to face before." He sneered. "Right. Because I stopped you at a door. That's what this is all about, isn't it?" And just like that, the air shifted. Imani walked toward the table slowly, placed both hands on the polished wood, and looked at every face seated around her. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice lower now, slower, as if choosing every syllable with care. 10 years ago, I was in Dallas. I just passed the federal entrance exams. I was young. Eager. Determined. I was assigned to shadow a courthouse security division for field observation. I wore the same blazer I wore this morning. I had the same badge. But it was my first day, and I was proud. Nervous, but proud. She turned her gaze back to Harlon. He had stopped breathing through his mouth. His lips pressed into a tight line. She continued. I arrived early. I waited in line like everyone else. When I got to the door, the officer on duty looked me up and down and told me I was in the wrong place. Told me to check the maintenance entrance. Said interns didn't belong through the front door. I told him I wasn't an intern. I showed him my ID. He took it from my hand, tossed it on the desk, and called for backup. There was a pause in the room. A pause filled with realization, with the hum of remembered faces. She took a breath. They escorted me out in front of the staff I was supposed to be observing. No one asked questions. No one stopped it. That man laughed as they took me outside. I remember his laugh more than anything. The way he leaned against the doorframe and shook his head like I was just a joke. That officer, was you. The silence this time was different. Heavy. Final. Harlon's face flushed. He opened his mouth but no sound came out. The room was still. "You don't remember it," she said. "Because it was just another day for you. Just another young black woman with ambition you didn't think she was allowed to have. But I remember every detail. And I promised myself that day, I would never let a man like you define my worth again." Counsel Everett shifted forward in his seat. "Are you saying this is connected to your findings?" Imani nodded. "I'm saying he wasn't just rude, or biased. I'm saying he's been connected to underground networks since at least that year. I'm saying that his treatment of me then wasn't personal, it was part of a belief system. One that feeds into the very threat we're investigating." Harlon stood up suddenly, palms on the table. "That's a lie. You're twisting everything. You're using some half-memory to destroy my life because you don't like how I talk to people." Imani didn't move. "You destroyed your own life when you chose hate over honor. I'm just the one holding the light now." He looked around the room, eyes pleading now, no longer defiant. "You're all really gonna believe this? Based on something that happened 10 years ago?" One of the analysts stood. A younger man in a gray suit, barely out of grad school. He looked at Harlon, then at Imani. "No," he said quietly. "We believe it because the data matches. Because your name shows up in secure logs tied to flagged groups. Because you were accessing restricted files from inside a government network. And because the woman you tried to erase just handed us the truth you couldn't hide anymore." No one said anything else. The agents entered again. This time, they approached Harlon with handcuffs. He didn't resist. But his eyes didn't leave Imani. They weren't angry anymore. They were stunned. As if only now realizing who she had become. As they walked him out, Imani turned away. Not to avoid him. But because he no longer mattered. What mattered was the silence left behind, the shift in the room, the unraveling of certainty. She had exposed not just a man, but a mindset. A legacy of gatekeeping. And in doing so, she hadn't just taken back her power. She had forced the entire system to look at itself in the mirror. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. Because if Harlon had gotten that far, connected to that much, then there were more like him. And now that the curtain had been pulled back, the real question wasn't whether justice would be served. It was how far the rot had spread, and whether she was ready to cut all the way through it. The moment Harlon was escorted out of the conference room, the air didn't clear, it thickened. No one relaxed. No one exhaled. It was as if the silence had learned to hold its breath. Imani remained still at the head of the table, one hand resting on the back of a chair, the other curled into a quiet fist at her side. Her eyes didn't follow him out. She didn't need to watch him go. That part was over. What came next required more strength than confrontation, it demanded endurance. She turned slowly to face the group once more, and for a few seconds, no one dared speak. Even the most hardened men and women at that table were trying to absorb the weight of what had just been revealed. Not just about Harlon, but about how close danger had sat to them this whole time. How easy it had been to look past the signs. Special Counsel Everett cleared his throat but didn't immediately speak. He looked at Imani, his voice a little more human now. "Director Bennett," he began, and then paused. "What else do we need to see?" Imani stepped forward, pulled a tablet from her case, and tapped through a series of encrypted files. "There's more," she said, voice low and unwavering. "Much more. Harlon's access was just a doorframe. But the house behind it, it's deeper than we thought." She projected a data map onto the screen, one she had spent the last 4 months constructing. Dots, lines, locations, usernames, everything color-coded and layered with timestamps. "There's a communication thread we've been tracking under a hidden subnetwork that links courthouse personnel to militia-backed forums. The language isn't always explicit. They use codes. Phrases that sound harmless on the surface. But repeated over time, they build patterns. Calls to action. Instructions. Names. She zoomed in on one section, Houston. Several usernames glowed red. We confirmed 2 of these IDs as current employees. Another belongs to a former consultant who still has clearance through a contractor loophole. But one name stood out. This one. She pointed. Alias matched to a ghost protocol server, tied to logins from inside this building. The alias? It's a play on an old military call sign, one that was Harlon's back in '09. It was used to coordinate encrypted drop locations for physical transfers of documents. The weight in the room shifted again. This time, it wasn't surprise. It was fear. The kind of fear that comes when people realize how close they've been sitting to betrayal. Someone down the table whispered, "Jesus Christ," Imani's voice cut clean through the quiet. He wasn't just a bigot with a badge. He was an inside link. A quiet hand passing information between 2 worlds. One of the senators leaned forward, pale and shaking slightly. "You said drop locations. What kind of documents were being moved?" Imani turned to him slowly. "Sensitive court case files. Employee logs. Names of judges involved in rulings against militia members. Possibly even juror information." Another voice, firmer, this time from the federal prosecutor. "Are you telling us Harlon was part of a direct threat against the justice system itself?" Imani didn't hesitate. "Yes. And he wasn't acting alone." That landed like a hammer. Across the room, Everett pushed back in his chair, running a hand down his face. "Do we have enough to move on the others?" he asked, half to himself, half to her. "We will," Imani said. "But we need time. We need access to deeper logs. Some of it stored in federal servers, but some," she looked up, the realization settling visibly across her expression, "some is physical. He's old school. Harlon wouldn't trust everything to digital storage. He kept backups. Notes. Maybe even recordings." Everett stood. "Then we get a search warrant. Immediate." But Imani didn't move. "There's something else," she said. Her voice was softer now, but sharper. "I know where he keeps them." Everett looked at her. "How?" And in that moment, Imani finally exhaled. "Because when he humiliated me all those years ago, it wasn't just about me being there. He was paranoid. He said something I've never forgotten. He said, 'This courthouse isn't as secure as they think it is. The real safety is in what no one bothers to look at.'" The room fell quiet again. Everett narrowed his eyes. What was he referring to? "The maintenance tunnels," Imani said. "The old ones. Beneath the building. They were part of the original structure, sealed off in the early 2000s. But Harlon used to joke about knowing the courthouse better than the architects. I thought it was just ego. Now I'm not so sure." Everett didn't hesitate this time. He turned to the agents. "We get a ground team down there. Now. Quietly. No one else in the building needs to know." As the group scrambled into motion, Imani remained rooted. She could feel something building, not panic, not yet, but a knowing. That feeling in her chest that had always been right before. When the data didn't align. When the names didn't add up. She felt it the night she uncovered the ghost thread. She felt it the morning she looked into Harlon's eyes and saw not confusion, but recognition. As the team mobilized, she followed Everett down the hall. Their steps were urgent but silent, flanked by security, descending levels of the building the public never saw. At the base of the final staircase, a rusted metal door stood crooked on its hinges. One of the agents pried it open, and a cold, musty breeze drifted out from the dark tunnel beyond. Flashlights flicked on. Guns drawn. Imani walked at the front. They moved slowly, deeper into the passage. The tunnel curved and split, walls marked with faded spray paint and graffiti from decades past. Then, in a hollowed-out corner beneath a broken light, they found it, an old locker, sealed with a padlock that had no business being that new. One agent cut it clean. Inside, notebooks. The hallway outside the hearing chamber pulsed with quiet urgency. Federal agents moved with clipped precision, their radios murmuring with instructions, but the sound barely touched Imani's awareness. She stood at the edge of the corridor, staring out through a narrow window that overlooked the concrete courtyard below. Harlon had been taken out a different exit, through a private corridor flanked by 2 officers from internal affairs. She hadn't watched him go. Not because she didn't care, but because there was too much still to be done. The silence that followed his removal hadn't felt like peace. It felt like a shifting weight, a subtle recalibration of everything around her. One man had been exposed, yes, but systems rarely collapse from the fall of a single figure. And what remained now was the real work, accountability, repair, and the navigation of moral terrain where justice was never black and white. Inside the room, the conversation had turned toward damage control. Everett was already pacing, speaking into a phone pressed tightly to his ear, issuing updates to the Department of Homeland Security. The lead investigator from the Inspector General's office had opened a separate laptop, pulling access logs from the past year. There was tension in the air, not the kind that comes with panic, but the kind that accompanies revelation. Every face around the table was marked with the slow realization that this had been bigger than any of them were ready to admit. Imani re-entered, her step steady, but something had changed in her face. Not defeat, not triumph, just focus. That sharpened edge she carried when something had moved from personal to historical. As she returned to her seat, Everett looked up. His voice was quieter now, almost careful. "We're tracing every internal link he had, every conversation, every contract, every meeting. His clearance should have been revoked 5 years ago. There's no excuse for this kind of oversight." Imani didn't answer right away. She let his words hang, watching how they curved around the room. Then, finally, she asked what no one else had dared to. "Do you believe he was working alone?" The silence was sharp. Everett sighed, sinking into the seat across from her. "I want to believe he was. God, I want to. But these files you've brought forward, the patterns, it's more than just negligence. It's orchestration." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "He wasn't just keeping people out, Imani. He was moving people in. People who don't believe in the Constitution. People who think violence is a form of patriotism. We've seen this before, in whispers, in encrypted forums. But we never imagined the proximity." Imani felt a knot tighten in her chest. The implications were heavier than the room could bear. If the conspiracy extended beyond Harlon, if others had embedded themselves into federal systems, then what she had uncovered wasn't just a case of abuse, it was infiltration. And that meant the very institution she had climbed, defended, and dedicated her life to, was compromised from within. It was a betrayal that reached deeper than personal grievance. It was a sickness in the foundation. She stood again, crossing to the screen where her own presentation still displayed, documents, time stamps, a redacted name with too many connections to ignore. One file stood out. A training session from 9 years ago. A rural security seminar hosted in Baton Rouge. Harlon's name was logged alongside 2 others, one of whom now worked in the digital surveillance unit in D.C. She tapped the screen. "This man. Has he been contacted?" The analyst checked his files. "He's on leave. No contact in 72 hours. Imani's eyes narrowed. "Find him. Now." While the room swirled with action, a quiet internal battle raged beneath her composed exterior. The higher she went, the more she saw. And now, more than ever, she felt the weight of the moral complexity pressing down on her. She had built her career on order, on belief in systems and structures, in protocols and hierarchy. But today those same structures had sheltered a man like Harlon for years. Today they had failed her. And not just her, every person whose complaint was ignored, every whistleblower silenced, every applicant who never got past the first checkpoint because someone like Harlon decided they didn't look the part. Was her presence in this room enough to change that? Was this moment, this exposure, really going to ripple outward? Or would it be contained, managed, swept into the endless bureaucratic shuffle until nothing meaningful remained? These were not questions she could answer with intelligence reports or surveillance logs. These were questions of conscience, of courage. And perhaps the most painful question of all, the one she hadn't allowed herself to say out loud until now, was whether the system she served was truly redeemable. Everett approached again, a tablet in hand, concern creasing his forehead. The DC contact is missing. No word since Tuesday. Last pinged location was near a decommissioned comms hub in Maryland. It's not a coincidence, is it? Imani took the tablet, scanned the data, and closed her eyes briefly. No, she whispered. It's not. In that moment, a shift occurred inside her. Not a collapse, not despair, but a new resolve. She could no longer pretend that exposure alone was enough. This wasn't about shining a light and hoping the darkness scurried. This was about stepping into the dark herself and dragging the rot into the open. Piece by piece. Name by name. With or without the support of the institution that had failed to see what she'd seen. A junior staffer knocked and entered, eyes wide, cheeks flushed. "Director, there's media outside." Words leaked. "They're asking for a statement." Everett turned sharply. "Tell them we're preparing an internal report, no comments at this time." But Imani raised a hand. "No. Let them in. Let them see." The staffer hesitated. "Ma'am." Imani looked directly at her. "Let the world see what happens when we pretend racism is just a conversation. When we ignore its function. When we call it discomfort instead of danger." She turned to Everett. "We've spent too long thinking accountability happens quietly. It doesn't. It happens in the light." Everett exhaled, but said nothing. He understood. Maybe not fully. But enough to step aside. Later, standing in front of the podium hastily arranged outside the courthouse, Imani faced a sea of cameras, microphones, and flashing lights. The questions came like gunfire, fast, sharp, relentless. Was this personal revenge? Why wasn't he flagged sooner? How deep does this go? She raised a hand. Silence fell. Then she began. What happened today isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of something far larger, something many of us have felt but couldn't name. We've been taught to be silent, to endure, to push through. But the truth is that silence is what allowed this man to operate for years. And I won't be silent anymore. She paused. The crowd leaned in. This is not about one officer. It's about the doors that remain closed. The ones some of us have to knock on 100 times just to be seen. And sometimes, even when we're seen, we're still told we don't belong. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of it was enough. I didn't expose him to humiliate him. I exposed him because I made a promise. Not to myself, but to every person who's ever been told, directly or indirectly, that they are not enough. That their identity is a threat. That their excellence is inconvenient. The cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled. But Imani wasn't talking to them. She was talking to the ones watching from their living rooms. The ones sitting quietly in their offices. The ones scrolling past headlines on their phones and thinking, for the first time, that maybe they weren't crazy for feeling overlooked, erased, dismissed. Inside the courthouse, the system began to move, slowly, but tangibly. Files were reopened. Background checks reprocessed. Access logs reviewed. What had started as one confrontation had bloomed into a full-blown internal audit. The ripple effect she'd feared might be nothing was beginning to spread. But with it came new threats. Subtle messages. Political pressure. Hushed calls suggesting she should let the dust settle. And now, she stood at a crossroads. Because to push forward meant risk. Isolation. Retaliation. It meant becoming a symbol when all she had wanted was to do her job well. But to stop now would mean letting it happen again. To someone younger. Someone without her platform. Someone who might not recover the way she did. That was the real dilemma. Was justice worth the weight it placed on her shoulders? And if the cost of change was becoming the enemy of the system she once swore to protect, was she willing to pay it? As she stepped back from the podium, her phone buzzed. One new message. A name. One she never expected to see. And just like that, she realized, the story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The message on Imani's phone was brief, but its weight was undeniable. A single name, unbolded and unassuming, buried beneath layers of bureaucratic plainness. Yet it echoed louder than any headline or speech she had given that day. Jonathan G. Kessler. The name hadn't appeared in years, at least not in any files that mattered. But Imani knew that name like a scar you stopped noticing until it was touched again. Kessler had been a mid-level contractor once, buried inside the technical logistics arm of a private defense firm. On paper, he was forgettable, no direct reports, no scandals, no glory. But she remembered him for something else. Years ago, when she was still learning the balance of trust and distance in her role, he had invited her into a closed-door review, one where she was the only black woman in the room. And it was in that room he had spoken of her impressive composure, but in a tone that made the compliment feel more like a curiosity. She'd always sensed something behind his words, behind the way he watched people when they weren't speaking. But she hadn't had the power to question him then. Now, he was reappearing in the data logs connected to Harlon's last accessed accounts. His IP was flagged in the same timeframe as several unauthorized entries into classified security documents Imani herself had filed. She paced the floor of her office inside the federal building, her heels clicking softly against the polished tile, each step a controlled release of the storm building in her chest. Marcus, her lead investigator, sat quietly by her desk, watching her with a knowing stillness. "You recognize the name," he said finally, though it wasn't a question. She nodded without turning. "I do. He's the thread we missed." While we were focused on Harlon, Kessler was moving behind the curtain. Feeding him. Shielding him. Marcus frowned, scrolling through the report again. His access should have been revoked years ago. There's no sign of recent employment. No current contracts. Imani stopped pacing, her voice lower now, more resolute. Which means someone left a back door open. And it wasn't by accident. The weight of it settled in the room like dust. The implications were endless. If Kessler had managed to maintain invisible access to active federal systems, if he'd remained connected to individuals like Harlon without raising alarms, then their failure was far worse than they thought. It wasn't just about infiltration. It was about negligence at a systemic level. Or worse, intentional blind spots. Imani sat down slowly, folding her hands together, her fingers tightening with the force of what this discovery could mean. "We need to find him. Quietly. Before this turns into something we can't contain." Later that evening, under the muted hum of the city, Imani met Everett in a secure conference room. His expression was drawn, a mix of admiration and fatigue. "The stories everywhere," he said, dropping a folder on the table. "You're being called everything from a hero to a radical. You sure you're ready for this?" Imani didn't flinch. "I didn't ask to be called anything. I asked for a system that doesn't fold the moment someone demands accountability." He exhaled, tapping the folder. "That's why they're afraid of you. Not because of what you've done, but because you've forced them to look at what they allowed. She opened the folder. Inside were background checks, redacted interviews, scattered intel reports. All circling back to Kessler. Her eyes moved rapidly, reading patterns, connecting dots. Then she found it, a scanned receipt from a security badge issued 3 months ago to a building leased under a subsidiary name in Virginia. A name she recognized from another case, one that had been quietly dismissed for insufficient evidence. She sat back in her chair, her heart pounding against her ribs. He's been setting this up for years. This isn't about infiltration anymore. This is a coordinated internal decay. People like Harlon are just foot soldiers. Kessler's the architect. Everett ran a hand through his hair. If that's true, then we've been playing the wrong game. We've been reactive. Defensive. Imani met his eyes. Then it's time to change the rules. The next morning, a decision was made. She would lead the investigation personally. A task force would be formed under her direction, covert, agile, and separate from the standard chain of command. It wasn't just a security operation. It was an excavation. And with it came pressure from all sides. Members of the Senate began issuing quiet inquiries. Some framed as support. Others as veiled threats. One call in particular stood out. A senior aide from the Oversight Committee. His voice was smooth, polite, practiced. But beneath the words was a warning. Director Bennett, we appreciate your initiative, but this path you're walking, it's going to make powerful people very nervous. Imani answered without pause. Then let them be nervous. At home that night, alone for the first time in days, she stood in front of her mirror and removed her blazer slowly. The fatigue in her bones was deep, but the fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed. She thought of her mother, of those long nights when Rochelle would fall asleep in her scrubs at the kitchen table, exhausted but unbroken. She thought of her younger self, of that day in Dallas when she'd been turned away at the door by a man who never imagined she'd rise. And she thought of the girls watching her now, the ones whose names she didn't know, but who would one day knock on similar doors and deserve to be welcomed in. Her phone rang again. Marcus. His voice was urgent, breathless. We found him. He's in the building. Not just his location, he's active. Logged in under an old clearance protocol from Homeland. Someone gave him temporary reinstatement. The code came from the inside. Imani's heart stopped. Inside where? Marcus hesitated. Here. In this office. Someone you trusted. The betrayal was a knife she hadn't seen coming. Within minutes, she was back in the command center. Security protocols were locked. The building was swept. Kessler had slipped inside as a contractor consultant 2 weeks ago, buried under layers of authorized access forged by a recently retired official who had vouched for him in writing. He had embedded himself in the digital forensics team under a new name, blending in, watching, collecting data on the very investigation Imani was leading. When they confronted him, he didn't run. He sat calmly in a corner office, typing until the last second, then looked up with the faintest smile. Impressive work, he said, voice even. I always knew you'd be the one to catch me. I just didn't expect it so soon. Imani stepped forward, her voice cold steel. You've compromised federal integrity. You manipulated access points. You trained and protected a network of men responsible for hate crimes and internal sabotage. Kessler's smile didn't fade. No, Director. I didn't manipulate anything. I took advantage of what was already broken. I just made it work for me. The room was still. Imani stared at him, the rage behind her chest measured but boiling. Do you know what you've done? Kessler leaned back, eyes gleaming. I've exposed the illusion. You think you fixed something today with Harlon? That's adorable. But the truth is, there are dozens more like him. Some in uniform. Some in suits. You think exposure scares them? No. What scares them is you. Because you're the one thing they can't discredit. You played their game and won. She didn't blink. You're right, she said. I did win. And now I'm rewriting the game. He was escorted out in silence. The following hours were a blur: press statements, interagency meetings, rapid response evaluations. But through it all, Imani remained calm. Focused. Every thread Kessler had touched would be pulled. Every name. Every clearance. Every contract. This wasn't just about cleaning up the mess. It was about changing the culture that allowed the mess to fester in the first place. And as she stood again before the cameras, this time not to explain, but to declare the beginning of a formal national investigation into systemic exploitation within security networks, she didn't speak of victory. She spoke of responsibility. Because the real battle was not over. It was just beginning. The corridors of the federal building had never felt heavier. Every footstep, every echo of distant voices behind glass doors, carried the gravity of everything Imani had set into motion. What started as a confrontation outside a courthouse had unraveled into something far more profound, something vast and rooted in layers so tightly woven that even now, with 2 arrests and a full-scale investigation underway, she could feel how much remained untouched. She moved with purpose, but internally she was navigating a storm of emotions: righteous fury, deep fatigue, guarded hope. In the moments when the noise faded, she was left with questions that didn't have easy answers. Had she gone far enough? Had she waited too long to act? And most of all, could this machine of layered power structures and veiled alliances really be dismantled from the inside? Marcus caught up with her outside the Situation Room, a file clutched in his hand, his face marked by sleeplessness and resolve. "You need to see this," he said, urgency unmasked. She took the folder without a word and began flipping through the contents as they walked. Inside were the transcripts of intercepted communications, old but coded, complex, layered. It didn't take her long to recognize the patterns. These weren't isolated conversations. They were the framework of an ideology, a strategic movement hiding behind defense contracts and consultancy language. It wasn't just about white supremacy or extremist dogma. It was about access. Influence. The kind of infiltration that wore badges, wrote policies, approved budgets. Kessler had been more than a saboteur. He had been a builder of networks. A silent architect of corrosion. She stopped at the end of the hallway and turned to Marcus. "How many names?" He hesitated. "We've confirmed 9, but that's only from one branch. If we cross-reference these entries with old internal affairs suspicions and inactive files, the list could double. Maybe more." Imani felt the weight of that number like a stone in her chest. 9 individuals in positions of power, operating under the guise of loyalty to country, while quietly reinforcing a system that rewarded exclusion and punished resistance. She thought about the thousands of officers and analysts working honestly every day, black, brown, white, all of them, but living under policies shaped by people like Kessler. Quietly sabotaged by the very institutions they swore to protect. They entered the command center. Screens flickered with live intel. Staff moved quietly but quickly, the tension of the past 72 hours thick in the air. Everett was already inside, leaning over a desk with a digital forensics agent, the two speaking in hushed tones. When he saw Imani, he straightened, offering a subtle nod. She approached, voice steady. "I want everything Kessler touched reopened. Every contract, every training protocol, every audit he cleared. And I want interviews with anyone who hired him in the last 10 years. No exceptions." Everett didn't argue. He just looked tired. "They're already pushing back. There are whispers about overreach. Some are questioning your authority to lead this kind of sweep." Imani's jaw tightened. "Let them question it. They've ignored worse." As the day wore on, her office became a revolving door of meetings and briefings. Some were allies offering support. Others, more political, danced around the word concern like it was diplomacy. One senator, older and polished, leaned in close during a closed session and said, "Imani, you're making history, but history has a cost. Be careful you don't become the story instead of the solution." She met his gaze evenly. "Then maybe it's time the story changed." He chuckled politely, but the warning in his tone didn't vanish. Power, she was learning, didn't appreciate being dragged into the light. And those who had grown comfortable in its shade were now feeling exposed. That night, she sat alone in her apartment for the first time in days. The city lights poured in through her window, soft and golden, but they didn't offer peace. She was reviewing transcripts when her phone buzzed with a call from her mother. Imani hesitated, then answered, her voice quieter than usual. "Hey, Ma." Rochelle's voice was warm, but there was tension beneath it. "Baby, I've been watching the news. You okay?" Imani didn't answer right away. "I'm here. That's the best I can say right now." Rochelle exhaled on the other end. "I see what you're doing. And I'm proud of you. But I also know what it's like to carry things for too long. To be the only one speaking up. Just promise me you'll take care of your heart too." Imani closed her eyes. "It's not about me anymore." Rochelle's voice softened. "I know. That's why I'm worried." They sat in silence for a moment. The kind of silence that comes only from people who know each other's pain too well. Then Rochelle added, "I watched you rise, Imani. I watched you fight for space in rooms that never wanted you there. But don't forget, you don't have to burn just to light the way for others." After the call, Imani sat in the quiet, her thoughts racing. The weight of what she was doing had finally reached that place in her chest where ambition and purpose met exhaustion. She had started with a single act, walking through a door that someone tried to close on her. But now, that door had become a floodgate. And the responsibility to keep it open, to hold others accountable, to lead without crumbling, was heavier than she'd imagined. The next morning, she was back in the field. She joined the team at a secured site in Virginia where digital evidence was being cross-examined. There, a quiet agent named Tao handed her a hard drive recovered from a private server Kessler had used. As they opened the files, Imani's breath caught. Inside were not just documents, but video. Footage from years past. Training sessions. Internal discussions. And then, in one particularly damning folder, recordings of private conversations between known officials discussing the need to purify leadership pipelines and reclaim institutional values. She leaned over the desk, the screen casting a pale blue light across her face. Marcus whispered beside her, stunned, they were recruiting. From inside. Grooming candidates, building barriers, vetting by ideology, not skill. Imani's voice was almost inaudible. "It was never just about blocking people like me. It was about ensuring people like them never had to share power." That night, she faced another press conference. The footage hadn't been released publicly, not yet. But the pressure to explain, to update, was mounting. She walked up to the podium and scanned the sea of faces. She didn't read from a script. She spoke from the same place that had carried her through every moment since that courthouse step, the truth. Some people will say this is political. Others will say it's personal. Let me be clear, it's principled. We are not just investigating a security breach. We are confronting a culture of exclusion, a lineage of silence, and a system that has been allowed to decay beneath the comfort of tradition. What we've uncovered is not just failure. It's betrayal. And I will not rest until every person who played a part in it is held accountable. Reporters began shouting questions. She answered only one. When will the names be released? She met the camera head-on. When the country is ready to face them. As she stepped down from the stage, her heart was steady, but her mind was full. She knew the fight ahead wouldn't be clean. There would be backlash. Politically. Publicly. Personally. But something had already shifted. The people watching weren't just viewers anymore. They were participants. Witnesses. Some in quiet awe. Some in vocal defiance. But all of them watching as one woman dared to turn humiliation into reckoning. And the reckoning was far from over. Months later, the storm had begun to settle, but the landscape it left behind was forever altered. The investigation expanded nationwide, revealing not only networks of intentional exclusion but also decades of quiet silence that had enabled it. Over a dozen high-ranking officials were removed from their positions, some resigned quietly, others faced criminal charges. Federal oversight committees were restructured, and whistleblower protections were reinforced with new legislation signed into law. Internal security protocols were rewritten, this time with independent oversight and built-in civilian review. The term, security reform, stopped being an abstract headline and became a daily operation. Change, real and uncomfortable, had begun. And at the center of it all stood Imani Bennett, no longer just a director, no longer just a name behind a badge, but now a symbol of confrontation without compromise, of justice that did not come politely. Kessler faced federal trial on multiple counts of conspiracy, abuse of national systems, and unlawful data access. What surprised everyone wasn't his sentencing, but his testimony. In his final statement before conviction, he admitted to orchestrating the placements of officers like Harlon across key security positions, not because he believed they were capable, but because he believed they would never question the system. They didn't need orders, he said, calm and chilling, they just needed the right conditions to act on what they already believed. Those words became headlines. Debate erupted across the country. But Imani didn't engage in the noise. She remained where she always had been, at the intersection of action and integrity. As for Harlon, his fall was sharp and public. Once proud and untouched behind his uniform, he was now a cautionary tale, a man whose unchecked authority had crumbled beneath the weight of his own choices. He took a plea deal, avoided the worst sentence, but would never wear a badge again. In the end, he returned to his small hometown, where even those who once respected him now looked away when he walked down the street. But there was no peace in anonymity. Not after the world had seen him exposed for who he really was. In the silence of his days, he wasn't haunted by the law, but by the face of the woman who stood against him without ever raising her voice. Imani's story didn't end in a podium or a title. After completing the reforms she had started, she chose a different path, not retirement, but reinvention. She declined a presidential offer for a cabinet position. Instead, she founded a national institute focused on rebuilding trust between communities and security structures. The mission was simple: dismantle not only systems of exclusion, but also the fear and fatigue carried by those who had never felt safe under them. The work was intense, but it was personal. She visited schools, led town halls, and sat in rooms most federal leaders would never enter. Not to teach, but to listen. To understand. To prove that accountability didn't have to mean punishment. Sometimes it meant healing in public. The day she returned to that same courthouse in Houston, the one where everything began, it wasn't for an investigation or briefing. It was for a speech. The city had invited her back to speak on the one-year anniversary of the investigation's launch. As she walked up the steps, no security detail, no suit, no badge, people stopped to watch. Not out of curiosity, but respect. A small girl, maybe 8 or 9, stood holding her mother's hand near the entrance. She stared wide-eyed as Imani passed, then whispered, "That's her." Imani paused, turned, and knelt down with a gentle smile. "You ever been in a courthouse before?" The girl shook her head. "Would you like to?" The mother nodded through tears. And together, the three of them walked through the doors that once tried to close themselves to her. This wasn't a victory parade. It wasn't about revenge. It was about a cycle interrupted. A barrier broken. A door permanently opened, not with violence, but with truth spoken out loud, and a refusal to shrink when it mattered most. And in that quiet walk down the marble hallways, something sacred had been reclaimed. Now, if you've made it to this moment, if you've followed every step of this journey, I want to speak directly to you. You've just heard a story about a woman who faced power and prejudice and didn't flinch. But this story isn't just about Imani. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make when we witness injustice, the silence we break when no one else is speaking, and the courage it takes to hold systems accountable without losing ourselves in the process. This story asks a hard question: what do you do when the thing that's supposed to protect you becomes the thing you have to protect others from? And maybe even harder, what do you become when you decide to confront it? We all carry doors behind us, some we've walked through, others slammed in our faces. But every now and then, someone refuses to walk away. Someone turns around, holds that door open, and says, "No more." Imani did that. She didn't just survive the system, she changed it. So now I ask you, how many doors have been closed on you? And more importantly, what are you willing to do to make sure they stay open for the next person? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let us hear your voice, your experience, your fight. Because here, your voice matters. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, real, emotional, powerful, then make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like Imani's aren't just fiction. They're fuel for change. And you? You're part of that.